OK, time now for a look at today's newspapers with Jonathan Samuels.
So, time for the press preview. It is our first look at Sunday's front pages, and joining me in the studio to take a look at the headlines, journalist and author Christina Patterson and barrister and futurist Andrew Eborn. Good to see you both again. We'll chat in a moment after we've had a look at those front pages for you. Escape to Hell is the headline from the Sunday Mirror as it details the situation in Gaza. Meanwhile, The Observer looks at Israel's warning to those fleeing Gaza as they say the next stage is coming. Your Sunday Telegraph also leading with the Israeli ground operation in Gaza, as is the Sunday Times. There it is. The Sunday Express headlines the Prime Minister with the words, "We stand by Israel always," and reports on the former Labour leader joining thousands in supporting Palestinians in today's march. The Mail on Sunday focuses on today's London protest as well, picturing two women parading with pictures of paragliders used by Hamas. And don't forget, you can scan the QR code that you see on screen during the programme. Take a look at the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And to do that, Christina Patterson and Andrew Eborn. Let's get cracking. And what a miserable set of front pages they are. Andrew, why don't you set things off this hour with the Sunday Telegraph? We know this ground offensive is coming. Benjamin Netanyahu meeting troops today that are amassed on the border with Gaza. We don't know exactly when it's coming or indeed what form it will take, but it is sure to be bloody.
Oh, absolutely. And it's the horrific rhetoric of war, isn't it? He's saying that Israel's set to hit Hamas from land, sea and air. And we were touching on this earlier, but we get anaesthetised to these sort of stories until you start seeing the human tragedy behind it on both sides. And they always say that the first casualty in war is the truth. And I think what we have to try and do is to unpack it in a sensible and realistic way, shedding more light than heat. And we're really concerned, and we touched on this earlier, about trying to report the news without fear or favour. We're very concerned about the rhetoric that's used. Social media seems to accentuate that sort of side. And I'm really concerned, as I say, about the rhetoric of war. And certainly that seems to be coming on that sort of basis. But seeing the harrowing pictures that we see, I think it's really very, very distressing.
Yeah, it is distressing. And all the papers cover some of the awful images, including the front of the Sunday Mirror, Christina, a man there carrying an injured child. It's just hard to know what to say, isn't it, when you look at a picture like that?
I just think that we are living through a tragedy that is unfolding on our TV screens and on our phones, and that, very sadly, is only likely to get worse in the days and probably weeks ahead. And I think what happened in Israel was horrific, utterly horrific, and Israel has every right to defend itself, excuse me, and absolutely needs to crush Hamas, this terrible terrorist group that not only has committed atrocities in Israel, but is also essentially holding 2.2 million Palestinians hostage in Gaza. The very fact that when Israel instructed Palestinians to leave for their safety, and one can argue about how feasible it was for 1.1 million people to move in 24 hours, i.e. probably not feasible. But for Hamas to then say, ignore that, knowing that the net result will be that thousands of innocent Palestinians will be murdered in this war is utterly, utterly unforgivable. And the whole thing is heartbreaking to see families losing their homes, losing members of their families, children being robbed of their parents, people being wounded, slaughtered, because war is ugly and people will suffer on both sides. The young Israeli men and women who now will be fighting for Israel in what's clearly going to be a land war. I mean, these phrases, these military phrases, make them sound as if they are kind of natural steps in a kind of surgically precise process. They are absolutely not. There will be many, many casualties in this, and young Israelis will die, just as many, many Palestinians will die. And anyone who makes categorical statements on either side, I think, really has to be tread very carefully. One thing we can be categorical about is that what happened in Israel a week ago was a terrorist act, an absolute atrocity. But war is a murky business, and neither side should be committing war crimes. And Israel also needs to tread very carefully, because if they don't, then they will end up doing exactly what Hamas wanted, which is to cause a conflict which will engender many more generations of terrorists and also possibly cause a conflict that will spread more widely in the Middle East.
Yeah, and that's the issue, isn't it? Israel's saying they are now focused on eradicating Hamas, but this cycle of violence has been going on for decades. Yes. They may or may not be able to eradicate Hamas. Even if they do, something else will replace it.
And you're absolutely right. And the concern is that it fans the flames of prejudice against Palestinians. And obviously not all Palestinians are Hamas. And people look at that sort of stuff. And when you're looking at social media, the hatred that is being spread on both sides, which is now coming to these shores and elsewhere around the world, is really, really horrendous. And it's trying to turn around and say, look, everybody hates war. There are tragedies on both sides. We're personifying that now. If there is a way of trying to shine more light and less heat on the conflict, that's the way to try and do it. And they were talking about exercising restraint. And people trying to think about the numbers, 1.1 million people being displaced from their homes and told to pack up within a ridiculously short amount of time. And thinking about that and the tragedy that entails is really horrendous.
And ultimately to go somewhere that's only slightly less safe, isn't it? Sunday Express, Prime Minister, we stand by Israel always. How do you think, political leaders in this country have dealt with this?
I think political leaders, including Sir Keir Starmer, have dealt with it pretty well. I mean, thank goodness Labour is currently under Keir Starmer and not under Jeremy Corbyn. Can you imagine what things would be like in this country now? How much more unsafe Jews in this country would feel if Jeremy Corbyn were leading the Labour Party. Thank goodness he isn't. I think Rishi Sunak has got it about right. I did notice, actually, that Sir Crispin Blunt, who is chair of, I'm afraid I can't remember, chair of a particular organisation that advocates on behalf of Palestine, who is a Tory MP, has written to Rishi Sunak and an open letter to our leaders to say that they do need to tread carefully in terms of unconditional support for Israel, because, of course, we absolutely must stand by Israel as it has been attacked in this terrible way. But what Crispin Blunt is saying is that he will be holding to account any British politicians who are complicit in war crimes. So we are moving into very, very ethically complicated territory. And it does look as if Israel may have committed war crimes already. If it has used white phosphorus, that is a war crime. And as we have both just said, asking 1.1 million people to leave their homes when they don't really have anywhere to go to, when the roads are often blocked, and when, in fact, there was a convoy that appears to have been targeted by Israeli fire and people died as a result of it. This is very difficult territory. And while, of course, Israel wants to crush Hamas, and in order to do that, probably does need to go into Gaza and does need to target the tunnels and the control centres, it does not have the excuse of killing thousands or even tens of thousands of civilians in the process.
Yeah, Israel, I think, has denied using white phosphorus. Let me just tell you something that's come from the Foreign Office in the last few minutes. 3 UK government-facilitated flights have now departed Israel for the UK and Cyprus as well. More are expected in the coming hours. British nationals in Gaza have been told to be ready if the Rafah crossing opens, that bordering with Egypt, of course. Andrew, moving on to the Mail on Sunday, hatred on Britain's streets. Do you feel that Britain's streets are full of hatred?
I think there are elements of it, absolutely. If you hear some of the rhetoric on the marches today and what certain people are saying, there's some appalling things that are being said. I always say it's freedom of speech, but not freedom from consequences. And to the extent it's inflammatory language or it's illegal or and so on and so forth, and I won't repeat some of the language which was used, but inciting violence is wrong on any level. Whatever people believe on for the personal beliefs, inciting violence or instilling fear in people is absolutely wrong. And the particular thing on the Mail, they have some closed with people with the paragliders who went into this concert. It's deliberately inflammatory, and that has to be wrong. And again, what I would do is try to urge people to look at things in a sensible way. Try and work out, look, both sides, there are people involved. And if you're looking at that sort of side, let's not confirm prejudices, let's not continue to peddle hate. And basically, this is the real concern. We live in tremendous communities. Both of us live in very mixed communities. And they've lived side by side very happily for a long time. What's happening with this prejudice, it's inflaming the situation. And that's a really divisive situation.
Yeah, it is. Let's just finish this part, Christina, with the front of The Observer. And, I mean, it really does show both sides of the horrors here, doesn't it? On the one hand, Israel warning fleeing Gazans that this ground offensive is around the corner. And then in the column on the right, a teenage boy who was saved by his mother acting as a shield as Hamas came into the house.
I mean, I think this is a very well-judged front page, actually, and I do think that the Daily Mail front page that we just saw was inflammatory, unnecessarily inflammatory. These are extremely ignorant people who should not be exhibiting their ignorance and hatred in the way that they have done, but I don't think that is the most important issue that the world is facing at the moment. Whereas The Observer here is covering the agony, the absolute agony of both sides, and this story about the boy whose parents sacrificed themselves to keep him alive, it is utterly heartbreaking. His parents, he was in a safe room, and his parents were shot by terrorists. His mother used her body as a human shield. They died, his parents died on top of him. And he texted his family to say that, his wider family, to say that his parents were dead. I mean, that any child should have to go through that. It is utterly, utterly heartbreaking.
Yeah, got to me as well, that story. Thank you both for the moment. Coming up, we'll continue looking at tomorrow's front pages, including this in the Daily Express. Lift spending to boost our armed forces. Don't go away. Hello again, part two of the press preview. Christina and Andrew are still here. Andrew, Sunday Express, we know that Britain has sent various naval vessels to the region, and actually a survey's been done saying that we need to spend more on our armed services.
And it's not surprising, is it? And we're living now in fear. And they always say, it's the Edward Bernays, the father of PR, said the best way of selling anything is through fear. And so when you ask people, should we be spending more on our defence, it's not surprising. I think it was 55% said, absolutely, let's have a look at that sort of stuff. And they say realisation that the world is getting more dangerous. Well, we've just confirmed that today, the screaming headlines across that sort of stuff, where fear and the battles are brought to our streets.
I mean, it's been pretty hollowed out, hasn't it, our armed services over recent years?
I mean, to be fair, most people, when asked if a public service should have more money, will say yes. And then when it comes to paying the taxes, people are perhaps slightly less keen. But I think there was an assumption that by our politicians that the world was getting safer. I'm not quite sure what made them think that. But events in Ukraine and currently in Israel show that that is so clearly not the case. And I think our army has reached rather dangerous levels of underfunding. And although we do know that cyber warfare is going to be, sort of increasingly important, and intelligence, and one of the many shocking things about what's happened in Israel is that Israel has, probably the most most sophisticated surveillance operation in the world and still failed, and a massive failure of intelligence to understand what was about to happen to them. But the world is not a safe place, and we do need a stronger armed force. And so I think actually this is not just a case of oh, you know, it'd be nice if they had more money. I think the armed forces do need more money.
And you raise a very interesting point when they talk about, and these are lots of questions that need to be unpacked, is how was this not spotted, what happened last Saturday? And they applauded around the world about the security services and the information that they get. And apparently this has been planned for over a year. And yet they found nothing.
No inkling.
No inkling at all, that's what they're saying. So lots of questions we unpacked. And so I understand why people are scared and say, look, we must spend more and do more.
Andrew, front of the Sunday Times, you know, another personal story here, this time about a British student in Manchester who no longer feels safe on campus.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely appalling. He's had to hide his Star of David and things like that because he's so scared about the rhetoric which is coming from other people on that campus. And that has to be wrong. I always say it's freedom of speech, but not freedom from consequences. And we need to clamp down on this hate speech, and anything that puts people in fear needs to be dealt with very vigorously.
Yeah. You know, young people, you know, who you would hope would be the future, intelligent young people, when they look at this conflict, clearly struggling, like many of us are, but taking it out on each other.
I think
that's not right,
I think it's, you know, I think it's heartbreaking around the world, but in Britain this week, that so many Jewish people have felt unsafe in a way that they have never felt before. And the idea that a young person has to hide their Star of David, and that schools near where I live in London, you know, have had to bring in extra protection. Schools near where you live have had to close. They have had to issue instructions to their pupils not to wear their school blazers because they have Stars of David on them. This is Holocaust stuff. We are better than that. And any student who makes the kind of comments that apparently the president of Manchester University's Palestine Society said at a rally in the city centre this week, she said she was full of pride and full of joy at what had happened, i.e. that people in the name of Palestine were beheading babies and raping young girls. That is utterly, utterly, utterly disgraceful. That young woman does not deserve to have a university education. And I hope that anyone who knows her, heard what she said, ensures that she apologises for what she said and apologises personally to Jonah Jason, and also pays a price of some kind, because you cannot peddle that kind of hate. You just can't do that. We may be a free society, but there are limits. As we know, there are laws about Holocaust denial and there are laws about hate speech, and that clearly is breaking a law.
Yeah, she's not here to defend herself, but we take your point. Should we finish on some light relief? The British economy.
Hurrah!
Tell us about what the Chancellor has been saying, Andrew.
Well, I think it's interesting. He's going to slash all the red tape, which is really good, I think, on that sort of basis. We always remember that Rishi's sort of 5-point pledge, the way he said he was going to halve the inflation and so on and so forth, which is not a very ambitious thing when it was at 11.1%. We're well on course for that. The rhetoric as we lead up to an election, which may happen in autumn next year, as people are suggesting, is looking good. So basically, he's going to cut the red tape, is what he's saying. He's looking at advantages and advances that we've had in terms of looking after things in the medicine, my pet angle about sort of artificial intelligence and how that's helping basically increase sort of efficiencies and so on and so forth. And it was interesting, there was a survey in California where they said chatting to ChatGPT was more empathetic than chatting to your GP. So using technology is a really interesting way forward, and that's going to be some of the positive rhetoric we're going to hear more and more of.
All right, well, we'll see. It's been a pleasure having you both in the studio this evening. Have a good week ahead. Thank you very much.